do want to also talk about the sun thing, because that I find endlessly fascinating. And I notice it over and over
Right.
and over, not only with myself, but anybody that we are working with. Last year, a golf magazine was hiring me to write quarterly articles in their magazine. And so it was springtime, and I'm like, great, let's talk about sunlight, and let's give people a guide about smart sun exposure, which is to say, like, start early in the day. Don't expose yourself during the high sun if you're just getting started. Like, use shade. Use any other thing besides sunscreen if you feel like you're going to get a burn. We also talked about diet and how that interaction changes things. And the golf magazine rejected it. They wouldn't print it. I didn't think I said anything too egregious in there. Yeah, it sucks. But it's something that keeps coming up. How are vegetables affecting people's ability to stay out in the sun?
Okay, well, we evolved on this planet. This may come as news to some, but I'm a firm believer that we have in the science that humans evolved on this planet, and part of the environment that we evolved to deal with was the fact that we have this thing called the sun up in the air, which puts out a lot of UV rays, right? This may be troubling for some to accept, but the US military went and looked at this population in the Andes in this high desert. So basically no trees. These people are out in the sun all day long. They eat a crappy diet, high carb diet, by the way, but pretty traditional fats. And what they found is they didn't get, the harmful sorts of skin cancer, which is kind of what you would expect, that if we live in this diet, in this environment, we should be adapted to it, right? So let's say that you're a scientist in a lab and you want to figure out how to give an animal sunburn and skin cancer. What do? Well, you give them more omega-6 fats, right? Which, as we've discussed, are very fragile. And one of the things that will cause them to break down into toxins is ultraviolet radiation, right? So the way I've heard this described is it's like a rheostat. The more you give them omega-6 fats, the more skin cancer they get from ultraviolet rays. They've done experiments in humans where they are trying to figure out, what in the skin breaks down in under ultraviolet light into the things that cause inflammation. I mean, because, sunburn is an inflammatory response. It's a response to damage, right? And what they found is that the omega-6 fats that are in your skin break down into HNE, among others, my favorite toxin, and that causes this inflammatory response, right? HNE alone causes an inflammatory response because it modifies proteins, as we discussed before, making them PAMPs or DAMPs, right? Making them something that looks to the body like you have an infection, right? So it causes essentially an autoimmune reaction against your skin, right? So what should a normal reaction to the sun look like? You go out, you get pink, right? You get a little bit of inflammation because you do have fats in your cells, in your skin cells, which are mostly saturated. And I can't remember the name of it right now, but that causes a mild little inflammatory reaction. And the next day you get up and you're tan, right? So this has been my experience. I mean, anybody who looks at me, I'm blonde, fair-skinned, blue-eyed, and I live in Idaho now in the high desert, and I don't burn. If I go out long enough, and we're talking 8 or 9 hours, I will get red, and typically the next day I'm brown.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
This didn't used to be the case. I used to roast in 45 minutes, and we're talking sheets of skin coming off over the next couple of weeks. It was horrible. And one of the first things that happened when I dropped seed oils out of my diet was that I became resistant to sunburn. And the real notable, call it experiment, was my ex-wife and I were standing in the sun in Central Park for 2.5 hours in April. The leaves hadn't come out, doing a barefoot running class, as a matter of fact. And she had dark skin, and I don't, and she burned and I didn't, standing side by side, first big sun exposure of the year. That was what made her decide to change her diet. And shortly after that, we went down to Disney World and we're out in the sun for 4 days, didn't use any sunscreen, didn't get any burn, and that I moved to Texas. I would go for runs for 3 or 4 hours in the middle of the day in the sun, no sunscreen. I've used sunscreen once in the last 14 years, and that was when I was at 13,000 feet in the French Alps skiing. And I was like, okay, I'm not going to be an idiot about this. This is, the double whammy of sunburn, because you're getting it from the sun and then reflected off the snow. Right. And even then, I got red, I didn't burn.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, I think for most people, they wouldn't even consider being out in the sun without lathering themselves with tons and tons of sunscreen. And that's been our experience as well. I used to burn like crazy all the time. And we took a trip, it was this time of year, so it was late May last year, to Mexico, and it was full sun. The UV index went up to like 13, which I didn't even know was like possible. And yeah, like midday sun, we might use a little bit of shade, but we never burned. We didn't use one single drop of sunscreen. And that's been across the board one of the most amazing things that I've ever seen, as far as your skin's ability to be able to interact with the sun. And yeah, how that relates to diet, I think, is so critical.
Yeah, and as we were discussing the mechanisms on this, you're causing a helpful, appropriate level of inflammation, and you're not overwhelming your body with the UV induced production of these toxins that they kill skin cells, and they cause this extraordinary inflammatory reaction and this breakdown. And this is probably the most important thing to understand, is that this is the common mechanism of all these chronic diseases, whether you're talking, sunburn, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, heart disease, arthritis. All of them have this process of omega-6 fats breaking down into toxins, causing an inflammatory reaction. In all of these chronic diseases, even in obesity, you see this. You see infiltration by macrophages into these cells where the omega-6 fats are breaking down into these toxins, because it's a sign of infection, right? And cellular damage, and your body is trying to repair it. And body can, your body can certainly repair it. My experience was it took years before, it took a total of 7 years before I stopped seeing things getting better, right? My liver enzymes took 4 years to normalize. And there were lots of other things that got better over time. Some of them are really quick. My visual acuity got better right away, and I've heard other people say the same thing. The sunburn thing took weeks. My irritable bowel disease took 2 days. That was bloody awesome. But it's this common mechanism that you see in all of these different conditions that starts with a higher than evolutionarily expected intake of omega-6 fats.